America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Jordan Bruneau, Vice President at Job Creators Network. Today we're joined by Chip Rogers. Chip is the Chief Executive Officer of Americans for Fair Treatment. Chip will also be joining us for our second JCN Freedom Fighters Summit and Gala, May 1st and 2nd in Savannah, Georgia. You can get tickets to join Chip and the rest of the JCN team at jcn2025summit.com. That's jcn2025summit.com. Chip, welcome back to Main Street Matters.
Good to be back with you again, Jordan. Thank you.
So, Chip, why don't you start by telling our audience what you're working on to advance education freedom is to as many parts of the nation as possible?
Well, I actually began working on this topic back probably early, maybe even in the late 1990s, when no one really knew what school education freedom meant. Everyone back then had this idea, and myself a product of this. You just go to school where the government tells you to go to school based on your U.S. postal mailing address, which makes no sense at all, right? I mean, the idea that every child is different is not lost on anybody. The idea that every child is going to learn differently is not lost on anybody. But the fact the government says, hey, why don't you go to this school, and you're only allowed to go to this school based on U.S. postal mailing address, is really the way things have been done in this country for more than 100 years. And then back in the early 2000s, Dr. Bill Bennett, along with a lot of influential people, Dr. Milton Friedman, really began pushing this idea that we can tailor education around the student, but to do so, you're going to have to give that student and those parents some level of freedom. And so for the first probably 20 years of that movement, starting in around 2000 up until now, or up until about 4 years ago, we had school choice programs. I was the author of some school choice bills in Georgia. We were able to pass some student scholarship organizations that were very limited. Special needs scholarships that started down in Florida with Governor Bush way back in the day. But the reality is that we were just kind of working around the edges. And then something profound happened, and it was called COVID. And what COVID did was two things. One, it allowed parents to see firsthand what type of things their children were learning. Two, it opened up the opportunity for children to learn in a different way, a very direct one-on-one way, and in this case, a digital way. And I would add a third thing, and this is probably the most important. It highlighted what the teachers' unions were all about. I would say before COVID, teachers' unions, sadly enough, had a fairly positive reaction among many Americans. Coming out of COVID, that didn't happen because people saw that the teachers were more concerned about themselves than they were the children, those in the teachers' union. Again, I want to be very clear about that. This is the union, not the average teacher. My mother's a retired public school teacher. And so what we've seen in the last 4 years is a hyper advance of educational freedom states across the U.S. And so we're seeing this. I mean, this year alone, I think we're going to have 4 or 5 states, the biggest one being Texas, that just passed last week, that have now joined the educational freedom movement. And this is massive. This is an enormous shift in how children are going to be educated in the United States.
Wow, that's really exciting. We hear education freedom a lot. Can you explain what exactly how the mechanics work of a voucher program that are being offered by many of these states?
Yeah, it all works differently. I would say almost every single state has some sort of different form, but here's the genesis of it and really the idea. And this goes all the way back to, I used to give this speech a lot, it goes all the way back to John Adams, who said, an educated society is less expensive than an uneducated society. And he was exactly right. And so Americans, from really the founding of our country, made the determination that we're willing to invest taxpayer dollars into education. And that's really important. The goal here is to have an educated society. What too many people get caught up in, and I hate the term public school, private school, any of those terms, because let's not even put, or public education, private education, let's not put the descriptor in front of it. Let's just talk about education. How are children educated? First of all, every child is educated outside the home, inside the home. Parents are educating them, friends are educating them, schools are educating them, online is educating them. So they're getting education from all sorts of forms. But how can we maximize that with the taxpayer dollars that we're using? Well, it really comes down to a very simple choice. As I mentioned a moment ago, we could do something really dumb, which is to say every child goes to this particular school based on their U.S. postal mailing address. There's no logic in that whatsoever. Or we could do something really smart and say, hey, I wonder what person on earth cares most about the education of that child. The obvious answer is the parent. Well, how about we just take the money we were going to spend on that child anyway, the taxpayer dollars that are already allocated to that child, how about we take those dollars and allow the parent to direct where those dollars are spent so that their child gets the best education? And so that's really the meaning of educational freedom when you boil it down. It's very simple. We're spending the dollars, whether they go to public schools, private schools, charter schools, online schools, by the way, charter schools are public schools, home schools, the dollars are being spent one way or another. The question is, and the only question that we should really ever try to decide is, who dictates where and how that child is educated? Is it the government or is it the parent? Every one of these school choice programs boils down to that. You mentioned a moment ago, vouchers. That means a traditional voucher means the government is going to give you the money to pay for some form of tuition. Tax credits are also popular, which means you go pay for the education, and then you receive a tax credit for the amount that you paid. But there's probably 100 different forms that this can come in. But the whole goal is the parent directing where and how the child is educated.
Wow, sounds good. As Job Creators Network has been working with the Education Freedom Alliance, with ALEC and Unleash Prosperity to try to help pass as many state-based universal education universal education freedom programs nationwide as possible. Can you give maybe an update on how that work is going?
Yeah, as of yesterday, we just had the 17th state in the last 4 years adopt this form of universal educational freedom, and this is the state of North Dakota, which, by the way, just last week also passed for the first time public charter schools in North Dakota. So the new governor there, Kelly Armstrong, deserves a ton of credit. He has come in, he has changed things in a dramatic way, and not just the children of today, but the generations that follow them will benefit in North Dakota because you have the governor stand up and say, this is the way we're going. We're going to empower parents. But the big one, of course, was last week when Texas finally passed it. And I got to say, I've been watching some of the communication in Texas. I have never seen a larger group of people claim to be conservative and be against educational freedom. There was just a lot of pushback, even nonsensical stuff like high school football. Now, look, I'm the biggest football fan you'll ever find. I've probably, as a broadcaster, called 300 high school football games, all right? So I love high school football. There's no question about it, right? But at the end of the day, schools are for education, not for high school football. So I know you folks in Texas love your high school football. I know when I was broadcasting in Georgia, we love our high school football. But the reality is there's something a little bit more important than high school football, and that is education. So when I hear so-called conservatives or Republicans in states saying, you know, I think that we should maintain this system where children go to school based on the U.S. postal mailing address so that I can protect my good football program, as opposed to allowing children to have the freedom to go to the school that is best for them as directed by their parents, the people that care most about them. You know, I don't know that you can call yourself a conservative if you're aligning with Randy Weingarten and every other far leftist that wants to control children in the classroom. What you really need to do is come on the freedom side and align with Dr. Friedman, align with Ronald Reagan and many others who have long ago noticed that America will be better off when we use freedom for almost everything that we do, including education.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you've mentioned the demand side so much with giving the parents the choice. What about the supply side? Are we going to see a bunch of new education alternatives spring up to meet this new demand?
Well, we've seen that. You've actually seen that even without school choice, but that will certainly accelerate that, which is great, because when you have the dollars going to a school that must perform to keep those dollars, then what you're going to have is excellence. I mean, no one can deny this in any way, shape, or form. I remember years ago when I was a lawmaker discussing this topic. It was actually the topic of charter schools, which are a form of school choice, but a public school or a publicly or run by the government, not by a private entity. And they were bemoaning the fact that a charter school in the local area had shut down. And my response to that was, that's great. Mm-hmm. And they were like, what do you mean that's great? I said, it is great that any school that is not meeting the demands of the child and the teacher be shut down. Why should we ever trap a child in a failing school? And so when you have these the dollars that are going to be flowing out and following the child to the best educational setting, guess what? The best educational settings will rise up because parents aren't going to use that money and make those choices to send their child to a bad school. If they were going to do that, they would just stay at the school that they're at. But they're making the proactive decision to use those dollars and put their child in a better educational setting. And those schools have to compete to make sure that that child's being educated.
And it seems like a real push for this is the educational crisis that is going on in the country right now. I mean, from what I read, is it true that only 1/3 of students are proficient in reading and arithmetic?
You know, the NAEP scores that came out this year were historically low, and that's really they call it the educational report card for the United States. They were historically low, and we've been trending in the wrong direction for quite some time. And parents understand this. They know it. They saw it during COVID when they were recognizing what was being taught to their children. Unfortunately, we've become a society that has, in many ways, just accepted this lackadaisical performance. You know, I remember one time standing up in the well when I was fighting for educational freedom in Georgia and suggesting that and I showed the listing of where the United States ranked among the industrialized nations for educational performance, whether it was math or science or reading. And we were nowhere near the top, 30th, 35th, 37th back in those days. That was the early 2000s. And I reminded the people in the Georgia Senate where I was a member, I was like, you know, if the University of Georgia football team were 35th, 37th, 39th, all of us in here would be calling for the coach to be fired. We couldn't stand by and allow the University of Georgia football team to be that bad. But for some reason, it's okay that our children's education has fallen behind the rest of the world. And we walk around and pat ourselves on the back and say, oh, well, my local school is great. Hogwash. Your local school doesn't compare to what's happening in China, many places in Europe, and because they take education very seriously. And it's about time the United States takes education seriously. And the form of education seriousness that we're going to take is giving parents the choice to direct where their child goes to school and then allow those educational settings, whatever form they come in, to compete against each other to provide the very best service.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What about move it to the federal level now? Trump administration recently is working to dismantle the education department. Will that have any knock-on positive effects for the education freedom movement?
Well, it should, because those resources are being diverted back to the states where they should have been to begin with. You know, I hear a lot of people say, well, we need local control. And I agree with that, 100% agree with that. Education closest to the student, the parent, is the best. But what they mean by local control is let my local government determine how and where children are educated. What I mean by local control, which seems far more logical, is let the most local control in the house, the parents who live with the child, who raise the child, be the one to determine how those dollars are being spent. So with the federal education system federal government getting out of education, as they should, those dollars will flow back to the states where they've been for the most part. I mean, people forget we didn't have a federal Department of Education until Jimmy Carter created it at the very end of his one and only term. And a lot of people have been trying to get rid of it ever since then, but I would challenge anyone to show me significant successes that have emanated from that program being in place. And especially if you consider that what dollars went into that, I don't think anyone could ever prove that those dollars were a wise investment. So send them back to the states, send them back to the local communities, and ultimately what's best is send them back to the parents to let the parents decide how to dictate where those dollars are going to be spent.
I get frustrated with liberals' obsession about equality. You know, everything they talk about trying to make tax policy try to make everybody's earnings equal. My thought is always, look, if the bottom's going up, I don't really care how much the top is going up. It doesn't need to be an equal distribution of wealth. I think that's what the country is founded on. Seems to me that's their main argument against school choice and education freedom is the idea that, okay, you're going to have students self-select into the better schools, which is going to make the worst schools even worse off, exacerbating the educational divide we have in the country right now. How would you respond to that critique?
No, the worst schools should go out of business. They should close their doors. No child should be stuck in one of those, as you characterized it, worst schools. They should all be given the opportunity to go to a great school. Now, equality is good when you're talking about opportunity. Equality is not good when you're talking about results, because there is no equality of results. Right? You can never have in any society, even in communist China, equality of results. But in America, what we stand for is equality of opportunity, which is exactly what this does. It gives every child, no matter what your U.S. postal mailing address is, the opportunity to attend the school of their choice, what fits them best, so that they can maximize those results. And we will never have equality of results, nor should we. It's what makes America the greatest nation on the history of Earth, because we didn't want to have the same equality of results when we were attempting to go to the moon. We don't want to have the same equality of results when we were attempting to build our military. We didn't want to have the same equality of results when we were attempting to build the greatest economy that man has ever known. No, what we want for our country is equality of opportunity. Everyone has the same chance. And then how far does your work drive, does your intelligence, and all the other factors that go into success, how far can you take yourself in a world where you have the opportunity?
That's a great distinction. So May 1st and 2nd in Savannah, we're going to be discussing many of these themes. Do you want to just tell our audience a little bit about the event and the panel that you will be moderating?
Well, look, everybody who doesn't know who JCN is missing out. It's a wonderful organization started by the late Bernie Marcus, who recognized that he had that equality of opportunity and built something very special in Home Depot. And now a lot of very important people, myself, not part of that, but a lot of very important people are part of JCN, because we recognize that freedom, we recognize that self-responsibility, and in this case, opportunity and education are the keys to becoming successful in the United States, and collectively are the keys for the United States continuing to be the greatest nation on earth. And so we'll be celebrating a lot of that at this event, no question about that. In particular, what I'll be doing is hosting a panel to talk about what is happening in the educational freedom movement. When I talked about the last 4 years, we have now 16 or 17 states, with North Dakota passing universal school choice in some form or another. What does that look like? Where is that taking us? The good news is, I don't want to ruin this for everybody, but the good news is, I believe now with the passage in Texas, over half the students in America live in a state where there is school choice.
Wow.
Now, there's a long way to go. If you look at the numbers, there's still about 6 out of every 10 children attend the school that is directed by the government for them to attend. And then the other 40% fall into some category. They're in public school choice, a charter school, an online school, a private school, and somewhere else in that list. So we hope to get in a place in America where every child can go to the school of their choice, and none of it is being dictated by your U.S. postal mailing address.
Excellent. Well, I hope everyone who's listening to this will join us there. Chip, where can our listeners go to find out a little bit more about you and your organization?
Well, what we work for is on the side of public sector union members, and we're fighting for government employees who either have an issue with their union and they need somebody to help fight back, they've been discriminated against or something, or they just want to leave their public union, which of course is their Janus rights decision from the Supreme Court. And so we fight on their behalf to make sure that if you work for the government, which is a noble cause, like that's a noble job to be a public servant, but that they're not forced to be part of a union where the money is taken from them and oftentimes, more often than not, used for political purposes and political campaigns that are diametrically opposed to what they actually believe in as a public servant. And so our organization, Americans for Fair Treatment, that is what we do. We stand up for the people in the public sector workforce who don't want to be beholden to their union.
Well, Chip, thank you very much for taking the time to join us on Main Street Matters, America's Small Business Megaphone. Again, join us for the second JCN Freedom Fighters Summit and Gala, May 1st and 2nd in Savannah, Georgia. And we'll be back soon with another episode of Main Street Matters. And goodbye for now.